Welcome to Helping Organizations Thrive. Today, I do have the pleasure of Taren Gesell on the show. I say good morning to you and good afternoon for me. Welcome, Taren.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure. As I said, splash some water on my face, got myself camera ready for today. So it's fun to be here.
Well, it's good talking to somebody on the other side of the world in Canada, where my eldest daughter lives there. So there is a connection there. I'll just tell the audience a little bit about you. You are known, and we'll just have a joke about this, as Triathlon Taren, or formerly known as Triathlon Taren, online. And you're the founder and CEO of Motive, where you help endurance athletes get to their start lines feeling confident and across their finish lines feeling strong. And you run the second largest triathlon YouTube channel in the world, the most highly ranked triathlon podcast in the world, and you publish our most highly rated triathlon training books through your Triathlon Foundation series. And you've trained thousands of athletes online through your disruptive Motive endurance training app. And today we're going to take all your experience, obviously in business, but also in triathlon, and to explore stress management in stressful situations and how to balance right the things to create that sort of high performance. But before we go there, Taren, I'd love to ask you, what do you love about what you do?
You told me that this was going to come about 3 minutes ago and had a quick think about it. And I think it's related to what we're going to talk about with stress management. What I love about what I do now is very similar to what I loved about training for and pushing into new physical depths of triathlon. What I've always loved is seeing how far I'd be able to push things and progress. I think as humans, we're always very wired to progress and be competitive. I think it's in our nature. I think it's how we've evolved. I am very, very highly tuned to that competitive drive. And I had that originally as a triathlete. I mean, competitive drive and pushing yourself that's the entire name of the sport. But now, being a founder and a CEO of a company in the sport, it's kind of that same feeling. A lot of people ask me if I have any races planned this year. And I say, honestly, I can't even fathom racing, because I'm getting all of that same excitement, the same stress, the same fulfillment that I used to get from training for a race from pushing the business forward. It feels very, very much the same. It's that little bit of competition. It's that little bit of seeing what we're capable of, overcoming challenges. And whether it's training or in business, I really like that. And I think that can actually lead us into what we're going to talk about with whether it's stress in training or stress in business and stress in life. It's all kind of stress. It's very, very similar things. It's all of these things are just higher rungs on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but they're all based in the same foundation. So yeah, I find that push very fun, very exciting, and rewarding.
Yeah, you mentioned that push, and obviously we can push ourselves and we have a drive to do things. And we're going to talk a bit about high performance. And high performance is great, but it can come at a potential cost to our lives. So before we get into that cost, which is, we're going to talk about stress, is how would you define high performance for you?
High performance, I think, for everyone can be boiled down to one phrase that I heard once that I think people hear, but they might not really understand it. And the phrase is from a book about high performance. I think it was Magnus. I think the book was actually called Peak Performance. And the phrase was, more is more until it's not. And that high performance aspect of things is very fulfilling for people. It feels very good. For me, that's the pushing for a little bit more, whether it was in a race or progress in the business. And what people forget from that line is the until it's not. So high performance can be pushed out to everyone's individual limit, but that limit changes for everyone. So if we're putting some frameworks around this as far as training, which is a really easy way to explain it, Well, the point at which training starts to go past the diminishing returns and actually be counterproductive might be 10 hours for me, but it might be 30 hours for a professional athlete. So I think that high performance is relative to everyone's individual situation. So some people can perform at higher levels than others. And I think to just put a blanket statement of, well, high performance is X, well, X might not apply to every single person. I think X is relative to your potential. And you can always push out that potential, but you can't just measure yourself by some random arbitrary measure of what high performance is.
Yeah, and I think it's important to make sure that we do it from our own perspective, as in rather than comparing to others, because obviously we're all different, we're all unique, we have different DNAs, different drives, different mindsets. But how do we know when we are at that peak performance, and do we ever know we're at that peak performance? Have you experienced that yourself, where you think, I've got an example when I know I was at peak?
There are a few ways to physically start knowing if you're pushing yourself too far. And this is, I think, something that is still very much in its infancy. So, what we try to do with our athletes is give some measurable ways to identify if they have reached that until it's not moment. And research will clear this up, I'm sure, over the next 5 to 10 years, because we're starting to get some clarity on it. But there can be some very simple things that people measure to understand if they are pushing into their depths as far as they possibly can. One, the simplest one being, are you sleeping well? Are you sleeping soundly throughout the night, or are you waking up? Are you getting 7.5 hours sleep, or do you wake up with a jolt a little bit earlier at that, say, 6 hours of sleep? That's actually an indication, if you aren't getting good sleep, that you are too stressed out, that you're pushing too hard. If you can't nap in the afternoon, that wired and tired feeling, that's an indication that you're pushing too hard. If somebody needs something that is a little bit more specific and measurable and not quite as subjective as that, because people can kid themselves and get 6 hours of sleep and say, I feel great after they have 4 cups of coffee. Something that we like to do with athletes is start measuring their heart rate variability. And heart rate variability is very much new science, but we do have some indications that with several months of tracking heart rate variability, you can start understanding the sensations in your body of how much is too much. And what we like to recommend for athletes in particular, but this could be transferred over to non-athletes, is measuring your heart rate variability, tracking it every single day, writing it down, and seeing if the 7-day average dips under your 30-day average. And if that happens, it's an indication that your acute stress of what you've been doing over the last 7 days is more than you are capable of withstanding based off of your body over the last 30 days. So doing that over the course of 3 to 6 months, you'll be able to start pairing those moments where your 7-day average dips under your 30-day average with some physical sensations, with some of those subjective sensations, or some of the lifestyle habits where you can go, oh, I dipped under there. What did I do in the 7 days prior to that? And you can start gauging how much is too much, and getting some of those, getting a tangible measure of subjective feelings.
Yeah, and I think it's important to try and measure not stress, I guess, or what the result of stress is causing on your body. And it's great that you're taking almost an athlete type approach and measuring heart rate, because we can all measure our heart rates. And actually, that's quite an interesting way of seeing whether in the last 7 days, am I more or less stressed? I might feel stressed, as you say, subjectively. I've sensed some stress, but I'm not entirely sure. But actually having an indicator like that, which is probably really helpful. And, it's interesting how, we think about high performance. There's a lot of view about, pushing, and we've mentioned those words, push, drive. And actually, sometimes it's more about flow, isn't it? And being that more in your moments of peakness. And I guess, I guess, how have you found it? And probably more in your company in terms of how you worked out there, knowing that flow, that actually when you're in the flow, you're probably in the moment, which means you're not stressed because you're not thinking about the future so much. You're more in now, and you can control the now. And if you're in the now, you're more mindful, and therefore you're more at peace. And that's the sort of flow sort of place. Have you experienced that in your company, and how do you try and help yourself get yourself into that? Almost can we manufacture our flow, as it were?
I think so. I think you can back your way into it. Just finished a book on Steve Jobs, and it's not the Walter Isaacson book. It's a lesser known book that is more about how Steve turned from this lunatic 20-something-year-old into the Steve Jobs that we know, that's revolutionized the world. And the trick that he used was every single morning he would look in the mirror and say, if I only had one day left to live, would I be doing what I am doing today? And if he answered that question with no, too many days in a row, or it just felt like the no's were overtaking the yeses, then he knew that something needed to change. And I think it's very easy for us to adapt. Humans are great at adapting. That's why we have people living in frozen Arctic Canada, like I used to, and then all the way down to Saharan tropical climates. We can kid ourselves into thinking that all stress is good stress, but I think if we take a step back and try to look at things a lot more objectively and take that subjective out of it as much as we can with tools and tactics that take us out of the moment, I think that's really helpful, because in the moment we can all kid ourselves into a 16-hour week where at the end of the day or during, we're like, wow, we're being really productive. We're in flow here. But it might be excruciating as we're going through it. And not all that stress is good stress. Not all that extra work is good work. When we talk about push, that's something that I fully believe has become really twisted in this hustle culture, and particularly in the United States, which is dripping up to Canada. And this thought that all stress and inoculating yourself from all stress is the way to do things. And it's really just, it's missing the entire big picture that management of stress is important before you teach yourself how to handle the enormous amounts of stress.
So just moving on to that, I mean, I think stress is it's a helpful indicator of what's going on in our life, isn't it? And, naturally the stress response there, evolutionary wise, survival wise, it's there for a purpose. The old saber-toothed tiger, or if you're in the frozen parts of Canada and you fall into a lake, the stress response is valid and vital to try and get you out of that situation. Adrenaline, heart rate going up, all that sort of stuff is really helpful. It's, I guess, what we're talking here now is the more chronic, isn't it, sort of stress, in terms of continuous in a stressful situation when you don't really need to be. Or I think sometimes we perceive, as you said, stress is a good thing, and it's like, it's just the wrong narrative to have. It's not a good thing. It's a good thing in the right scenario, basic survival, but on an everyday, it's not very good. So how do we sort of reframe that, but also how do we then start to manage our stress in a helpful way that doesn't have an impact on us physically, but also mentally?
Well, almost all things in the world have a dose at which it's lethal. And stress is the same. That not all stress is good for us, and not all stress makes us harder, better, faster, stronger, smarter. Not all stress is going to make us progress. And not all stress is also bad. Some stress is good. A little bit of stress is actually very good. One of the reasons that vegetables are good for us is because they have tiny little bits of a hormetic response that they are slightly stressful for our body, and our body adapts to that. So stress that is well managed is good. But the analogy that I like to use about managing stress is if you put your hand on a hot element and you went, oh my God, geez, and you got injured from it, would you, well, then go say, oh man, the next time I put my hand on a hot element, that is really going to hurt. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put my hand on a hot element for a little bit every single day and make my hand really strong. No, you would stop doing that. We need to understand that we need to pull back from stress at some points. And in some cases, the best way to manage it is by avoiding it in the first place. And having tools to understand when should we pull ourselves back, being heart rate variability, being sleep, motivation. Motivation is an excellent tool that people think pushing and bursting through low motivation and just overcoming it is a badge of honor. Well, low motivation is actually the first indication that we are probably answering that question of, would I do this if this was the last day I was on this earth? Low motivation is kind of an indication that we've probably answered no too many times. Athletes, very smart athletes, use low motivation as a tool for when they should start pulling themselves back. It's not always something that should be pushed through. So I'm giving a lot of somewhat subjective ways to see when you're pushing into your too much stress versus your sweet spot of high performance. But it's not a hard, fast science where we can say, all right, this is my sweet spot. It is just starting to recognize some of those subjective measures.
I mean, so obviously stress in itself, obviously, is not good. And I think, as you say, not using it to push for performance or use it for performance. What are the hacks that you found that have helped you to manage it in a way that you still get that high performance, you still get that sense of peakness, and whether that's in your sport or in your company, what are the ways that almost your daily hacks? Because I think a lot of this becomes through, you might say something differently, is through a regular, consistent, daily, weekly sort of regime in some shape or form, I think, to sort of help manage, because you're managing something, it's got to be a consistent over time. So I'd just be interested to see how you're managing it. And also, and you've talked about some of the ways that you're getting aware. I think that's a good place to start, is that awareness that we're in a stress situation, rather than getting to that point of burnout, popping, but actually before it even gets there, that knowing your sleep and knowing the fact you're low motivation, knowing the fact that you heart rate, if you can measure your heart rate, things like that, almost indicators early on. So what are you doing when you start seeing those things start to spiral a little bit, and you realize it's all going before you, and thinking, I'm starting to go into a stress situation here?
Balance is the key thing. And if we're looking at training, athletic training, or let's look at specifically endurance training, because there's a very specific measure that we target as athletes. Whether you're a beginner athlete or an elite athlete, whether you are training 10 hours a week or 30 hours a week, the rough breakdown of low stress versus high stress is about 80-20 that you want. You want to spend about 80% of your time at a low intensity, and this builds the foundation for fitness. And you want to spend about 20% of the time pushing yourself, digging really deep, working really hard. Those two work in conjunction. When you start getting down into 65, 60, 50% of the time in low intensity and much more time in high intensity, that's when the body starts to break down and build up injuries and overuse injuries, overtraining. It's kind of the same thing in day-to-day life. We need to have an appropriate balance between work and play or relaxation. And this isn't a hack. The measures that I talked about with heart rate variability and your motivation and the looking in the mirror, those are kind of the hacks that I think about, but more the habits that are helpful with getting that balance would be, I believe that work is going to be stressful. There's no way around it. So let's just accept, all right, it's going to be stressful. First, that acceptance of it's going to be stressful is part of the balance. if we look at that stress with more stress and go, oh my goodness, oh, this is so stressful, I need to change it. Well, we're just stressing ourselves out about stress and adding stress on top of the stress. So acceptance of work is probably going to be stressful. And in a lot of cases, family life, running kids around, running errands, doing the bills, that's also going to be stressful. But the habit that I see that's really had the dial turned up towards much more stress is what we do outside of those work and family commitment moments. So in the morning, what do? We grab our phone and we go into hunt mode. We hunt on Twitter and Instagram and YouTube for the next video, the next piece of content, the next article, the next email. That hunting is a sympathetic, it's a stressful state for us. Well, we used to just sit at the table reading a paper. So very different, much less stressful. At night, what do? We're two screening it. We're looking at one screen on the TV. We have another screen in front of us doing the same thing. We're in the hunt mode. We don't read a lot of actual physical books anymore. We read on our tablets. And reading on our tablet is better than scrolling social media, but it's still not as good as reading physical books. So the thing that I find tends to move that needle from imbalance to out of balance is what I do in those times that should be relaxing. If I'm spending my mornings scrolling social media, if I'm spending my evenings screening and looking on the iPad, I start to build up a lot of stress. My sleep starts going wonky. All of those things that I started talking about, motivation, mood, all of those things start dipping towards too much stress. And that tends to be how I find it's brought into balance a lot better. And the things that are the worst for us, just mindlessly scrolling. And we think that it's a passive thing, but it's like hunting. It's going out. I have to find something. And what do we find? We're finding some entertaining little bit of content. And that's a stressful state for us because we're focused in on this tiny little screen without our eyes moving side to side in a relaxed manner. It's a bright screen, which is very stressful for our system. And it's hunting. I am still turned on. A much better way to even spend your time, it had a bad rap in the 80s and 90s, watching TV, just watching TV that is passive. And then even better than that, reading on your tablet, even better than that, reading a book.
So when you get into that moment and you start getting I suppose, not a habit, but you start scrolling in the morning and the evening, and are you sort of conscious aware of you created some habits that you don't do that now, or some sort of ways of behaviors or regimes or rituals or whatever it is that makes you, because I know some people talk about creating new habits, and instead of like getting up to straight on your screen, and we all do it because it goes next to our bed. I've heard people, they put their mobile phone downstairs, so they have to physically get up to get it. So when they wake up, they're not straight on their screen. I've heard other people, instead of going straight to the screen, they have a coffee, which is fine, and they build a habit on their coffee. So they'll have a coffee and they'll do some mindfulness, and they'll just sort of. And so, what are you doing when you notice it? What do you do? And then have you sort of put something in place that minimizes that? I'm not saying you're perfect now, but what have you done to minimize those ways of getting more the parasympathetic nervous system going, which is more relaxed state?
I am far from having it figured out. I have a tremendously addictive personality, as evidenced by taking up triathlon.
Well, I was going to say you're a triathlete there.
Yeah, normal people don't take up that sport. We're all a little bit twisted and edge towards that extreme lifestyle habits. So I am very, very guilty of having bad smartphone habits. All the things that you talked about mindfulness, about putting your phone away, those are all things that I have to do. One of the biggest things that I would say is even a step before that is there was a book that I think it was called the Twitch, something like that. Starting to be mindful of that feeling where like my hand is moving off screen right now towards like a phone feeling that feeling where you've got to reach towards your phone, and having that as a mindful moment where you're pattern interrupting and starting to recognize that pattern is the very first step. That's not to say that you're going to be able to pull yourself away from it the same way that somebody quitting smoking has a really hard time quitting smoking. But at least being aware of it starts giving you that moment of, okay, I can choose to do one thing or another. I find myself that unless I have something else to do, like that mindfulness, like a morning routine, like something that I enjoy doing, that is more interesting than scrolling that phone, I'm probably just going to keep picking up the phone. So in my case, it's having a morning routine where I do certain stretches that I know help my back, help my eyes. And that's different for everyone. Maybe somebody has a shoulder injury or some rehab, or maybe there's some yoga that they like to do, something that they would prefer to do other than that to keep them busy. At night, binge watching things has a bad rap. I really don't understand why, when the alternatives are scrolling social media and consuming things that are very, very stressful. Binge watching something where you can get lost in a story, as long as that story isn't like the Jeffrey Dahmer documentary that is very stressful, very real, but like watching complete fictional stories, that is storytelling. That's what we did when we were evolving. We would sit around a fire and we would listen to stories from people around the tribe, get into that storytelling mindset. It's not as good as sitting and reading Tolstoy, but let's be honest, we still have to enjoy our life. So on those bookends of the day, in my case, it's a morning routine of mindfulness, of activity, of a little bit of movement, of walking the dogs. And then at the end of the day, it's finding a show that I just want to sit and watch 2 episodes of, and having that 2 hours of lying on the couch, scratching the dog, drifting away. And those are the things that help me. But yeah, you do have to insert something into those moments that are not stressful.
And I guess, have you noticed, and this is, you made a point about self-awareness, because I think that's really quite important here, is knowing those feelings in your body, in your mind, and being really aware of those natural habits of your hand just drifting to this phone, or your immediate response is to grab a phone. Have you found yourself, when you've been more mindful, when you've woken up and done those sort of nighttime, more relaxing scenarios over a period of time, that your days are more effective and feel, I guess, better? That's more subjective, but have you found that and noticed that yourself?
Oh, 100%. Had you asked me this question 10 years ago? No. But asking me now, when I've gone through tracking heart rate variability, being mindful of sleep, being mindful of, do I have an easy time getting into flow during the day? How's my mood? Having all of those subjective things that we started talking about, now that I am more conscious of those, 100%, I can tell you, based off of basically when I woke up in the morning, what I did the night before. Did I scroll on my iPad and look at houses or Zillow or Airbnb about places to go? Or did I just sit and get lost binge watching a couple episodes of something? I could tell you based on basically the minute that I woke up. If I had one of those scrolling kind of nights, probably going to wake up about 90 minutes earlier. And that's what's going to happen to most people. They're going to wake up during the middle of the night. They're going to wake up a little bit earlier. They're going to go, oh, well, guess I'm up because I feel awake. Well, that in a lot of cases is just a shot of adrenaline that is mistimed, because your body is gone to sleep when your body is ready for sleep, but your mind is still active. And you've just carried that active mind into sleep right up until the minute that you go to sleep. And that's how you get mistimed shots of adrenaline throughout the middle of the night. And if you start being conscious of those things, you'll start noticing them like right away.
Yeah. I was listening to a sleep coach, and they were saying the way to get sort of good night's sleep, they didn't talk about how long or anything like that, but a good night's sleep was all about your daytime routine, the moment you wake up and how you do the rest of your day through to your nighttime. And it's that almost the daytime routine will predict and help and enhance your sleep or not, as the case. You mentioned from a triathlon sort of, I suppose, analogy of the 80-20 sort of rule, 80% sort of low intensity, 20% sort of high intensity in terms of a training context. How do we do that in the context of business? Because it's probably not as easy because of we're not training ourselves as such and measuring as specifically. How do you do that in your business to keep that balance of stress is okay in the sense of high energy, going after things, that's okay, that's fine, but as long as it's only no more than 20% type of thing. How do you do that and create that, and then sort of, I guess, manage that as well?
I think it's very hard if your situation doesn't allow for control of your time. If you are an employee, or if you are even the founder and owner of a company and the company is very large and the company essentially manages you, in that case, it might be difficult. What I personally try to do, and with full context that our business is fairly small, we're 7 full-time employees, and I imagine as we grow, this will be the case. But I know that there was a time where I had 2 full-time employees and I was much busier than I am now, because I wasn't setting myself up correctly. And the things that I try to do, or really it's just one thing, is I try to give myself slack. And if I feel like I don't have slack, something probably needs to change. Because there's always going to be that stressful time, like yesterday is a good example. Just had a lot of calls throughout the day. Things that were supposed to take 15 minutes actually were 90-minute projects, and there were about 3 of those things that came up throughout the day. So right up until 6 p.m., I was doing some spreadsheet work. I was able to do that because I had slack in the day. Today is a much lighter day. The day before was a much lighter day. I think that we can do a lot of good in our business with 30 to 50 excellent hours. And if we are always pushed to 60, 70, 80 hours, I think it's very easy for us to tip over into that unbalance and have the needle move a little bit too far. I think having a little bit of slack, where you do have some afternoons every single week where you're like, what do I do right now? And you can just ponder and think like, okay, what is the most impactful thing that I should be doing? I think that's a nice balance, because that slack is always going to get filled by something if we are people who push for high performance. Like the time that we spend sitting on our hands is going to be very, very small. We don't really have to worry about being unproductive. We'll fill that time with productivity. But by having some of those moments where slack is built in, I think it just gives us a little bit of time to breathe and to think and have balance, and make up for those times where, like yesterday, I had an extra couple hours of work to do. I could handle that because I've been through some easier times on the days leading up to it.
Yeah, and I think, interestingly, I think when I was working in the corporate, I it almost became a bit of a back-to-back scenario with meetings and conversations, because it was deemed as being productive, effective, seeing many people as you can in a day, going around talking to people. And actually, I've learned, certainly working for myself, to build more slack time in that enables me to just to reflect and think. As a coach, I need to take some time out when I work with clients to have some sort of reflection time anyway, just to that conversation I just had with a client, but also to actually get myself sort of more self-developed through that sort of scenario. And so I think is really important. And I think also I found actually to, rather than be in a mindset of doing, because we get into constant doing by doing stuff, actually doing more being stuff, and just being either with yourself or even with others. Sometimes you just be with somebody.
I think thinking too.
Yeah. exactly.
The
Just
mindset of I need time to think. There's an excellent book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. The first third of the book kind of explains really what you need to know. And there's this culture of being busy, of being back to back, of doing lots of things is how you're productive. And Good Strategy, Bad Strategy talks about, no, the way that you actually make progress is by identifying the biggest key drivers in a system and focus only on those drivers. Coincidentally, I've also looked at all of the other companies that are very well known that bootstrap their way to success. Some of them are in competitive industries, some were in new industries, some grew like crazy and were sold for $12 billion. Others were $30 million in revenue, but profit 20 million. In every single case, the only consistent thing that I saw was that they executed very, very well on one thing. They found that one thing. And so much of our culture is built around, well, I've got 2 hours free. Maybe I should fill that with a couple of meetings. And you start getting away from that, finding that key impactful thing that actually makes a difference. And you go into this mode of, let's just be busy, because then I don't have to do the hard work of thinking.
And we need, as you say, and to know that, you need time to reflect and think about what you're doing or what you've just done, so you're more effective next time. I think that's really important. I think this managing stress and trying to create high performance is really quite important message right now, because I think, you know, we're all trying to sort of make our way and navigate challenges as well, because obviously external things on our lives can create stress as well. And you know, one thing I've always thought and got to grips with more and more so is, you know, just control the controllables. As soon as I start going to the state of trying to control things I can't control, then stress starts going up anyway. Thank you for your time today, Taren. It's been really good, and I really like the analogies and the comparisons to triathlon. I think people quite like that sort of sports. People can sort of relate with that, and your own experience as well, and how you're managing your sort of peak performance. If people are interested in what you're saying and want to connect with you and engage with you, what's the best way of doing that?
If they search for Triathlon Taren, some of my handles aren't Triathlon Taren anymore, but all of the algorithms will still be able to find me. Taren is Taren. And if people are interested in seeing what, maybe they're an athlete, train for a running race, a triathlon, a duathlon, a swim run, or a cycling event, and they want to see what a balanced training plan looks like compared to what they might think it is, and really what endurance athletes look like, which is like you and me. They're people that want to push themselves, but need a balanced training plan to be able to do that safely. Our website is mymotive.com.
Brilliant. Thank you for your time today, Taren.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.